that was one of the key turning points in my realization of our situation in the world, because it was like this microcosm in the world right in front of my eyes, right? Women with something to say and nobody willing to listen and being regarded as of no consequence, right? And Lynn, that was actually the moment when I said, this will end.
Felicity McRobb was brought up being told she could do anything as long as she put in the hard work. Moving across the globe, Felicity has lived within cultures where she has experienced what it means to be unheard and unseen. Because of these experiences and her upbringing, Felicity has made a stand to secure the space to hear the stories of those who have been ignored. Thank you for joining Lynn Foley, host of Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, as we hear from Felicity about her journey.
I was born and brought up in South Wales in Great Britain, and I'm the youngest of three daughters. My parents, so my father is Scottish, my mother is Welsh, and they had met they had both signed up for the RAF during the Second World War, and they actually met on the RAF base. So as you can imagine, we three sisters grew up with lots of stories about what it was for, the bomber command, for example, and the bombing teams to go from the base and go over to Germany. And my mother would often talk about how many planes went out and then they count them coming back. But I'm sharing that with you because it was pretty clear that our parents had determined, having been part of the Second World War, that there was a future that they wanted to build that was very different out of the ashes from the war. So, that was very much of our household dialogue. Lynn, I was also brought up, I was born in 1956. So, which isn't so long ago.
No, it is not so long ago, Felicity.
But it was at a time where a lot of the young girls that I grew up with were expected to get married at an early age, have children at an early age. And that wasn't the case in our family. We were brought up that we could be whoever we wanted to be. We could do whatever we wanted to do. And as long as we were willing to put in the hard work for it. So we, in that regard, we grew up in a very privileged. We weren't privileged in that we had a lot of money, a lot of resources. We had enough. But we were very privileged in that our parents had what you might call a much more modern approach to bringing up three girls. My mother was the power behind the throne, and everybody was very clear. You always knew exactly where you stood with my mother, and you never messed with my mother. And my father was the breadwinner, and he started out at British Petroleum. He literally, Llandarcy was our biggest employer where they lived. He literally went up to the gates and said, "I need a job." They said, "What can you do?" He said, "I can do whatever you need doing." And that was the start of his career there. He worked on what was called the barreling plant. And then he ran years later, he ran the Transport and General Workers Union for British Petroleum, which is the biggest union in the UK. And I tell you that because, we learned, we three sisters really learned that, my parents were always there, if you like, for the underdog, for the less privileged. And now when we go back and visit Wales, we're always touched and we're always stopped in the street by people who say to us, if it wasn't for your father who got us pensions, if it wasn't for your father who got us mortgages for our homes, if it wasn't for your father who got us safe environments, we would never have had our own home. We would never have had money in our retirement. We would never have been able to visit our family overseas, etc. And, when you grow up with it, it's just, it's just what happens. But, now that we're older, we really do appreciate, what being a stand for something makes possible over time.
So do you think it was that piece that you quoted to me when we first met, that you were always brought up to make an indomitable stand for something? So you think some of that came into your DNA from your dad, or did it come from role modeling?
Oh, DNA for sure from my from both parents, but also how they operated.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So your life and career from this very beginning has emerged as a result of a number of key turning points, showing you the way into the stellar work you continue to do today in the broad area of human rights. Women's rights are human rights. Can you please explore some of these key turning points and how they influence your next moves?
Oh, thank you, Lynn. Yeah, sure. I think one of the key turning points for me was I had an opportunity to go and live and work in Japan in 1983. And, sometimes it's the simplest of things, right? So some of my Japanese friends had children who were now teenagers. And, in Japan at the time, there were great opportunities, educational opportunities for women and men, for girls and boys, women and men, and job opportunities. But when a woman got married, and certainly if she was expecting a child, she was expected to leave the company. And it wasn't simply if you didn't leave, you'd be forced to leave, pretty much.
Yes.
And so these friends had left work, but their children were of an age where they wanted to have a career. And of course, I'm like, well, of course, I'll help you. So that's when I really learned the impact and kind of, the very real impact of culture, cultural practices, cultural expectations, and how difficult it is to navigate and change cultures. Because, what's the point of a culture? The point of a culture is to maintain the status quo. So anything you want to make possible, you can't make possible within the existing culture. You have to create new ways, new practices, etc. So that was probably one of the first kind of real opportunities, to, if you like, put my money where my mouth was.
What would be the next turning point which took you in a certain direction?
In Japan, I worked at a school. And we had a challenge with what you'd call staff-teacher relationships, so management-teacher relationships. And it got so bad, we had a consultant come to work with us. And it was remarkable for me. So she was the kind of consultant that never told us what to do or how to do it. But she laid out certain conversations for us to engage in, like, why did you come to Japan and what did you want to accomplish here? And if you continue down the path you're on, what will you never be able to accomplish? So what's important to you, etc. And at the end of the day together, then we hadn't reconciled any of our differences, but we had the room to come together to be able to do that for ourselves. And I just thought that was the most remarkable thing I'd ever been part of. And her name was Dr. Namiko Kominami. And that was the beginnings of learning what became my lifelong endeavor, which is transformation. Transformation as in something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. And corporate transformation, and then effectiveness, breakthrough performance. I really learned the foundation of what became my career. And also, as we talk later on in the Hunger Project, those really were the tools of mass mobilization, just applied in a different format. Yeah.
And applied on a grander scale at times, or sometimes on a smaller scale, depending.
Yes, absolutely, Lynn.
So I know that some of your other turning points have come out of the fact that you are, if I may use the term, a global wanderer or a global citizen, whichever term you might apply to yourself.
I think wanderer is good. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with that. You've lived in many different countries and been immersed in such a range of diverse cultures. What have you learned from the circumstances and experiences? And how did you deal with the situations where it was incredibly challenging and confronting for you, often as a female?
one of the biggest challenges, I think, personal challenges, and one of the greatest gifts of living in different cultures is that Japan was really the first culture very different culture that I lived in. And what it does is it forces you, if you're open to it, I suppose, but it forces you to realize that you have that we live from a set of principles and a set of values and ways we operate, etc., that are hidden from our view because it's so different. I could see things about myself and the way that I thought and what I said and etc. that I hadn't been able to see before. And I was able to see that a lot of what came out of my mouth was inherited. There wasn't an original thought. It was just I was repeating whatever I'd been taught to say, or I'd learned from somebody else, or what my country, etc., etc., etc. So that was revelatory to me, and pretty shocking at the same time, because it was like, well, I think I'm an original thinker. But when I actually took a good hard look, there wasn't much of an original thought coming from that direction. So I think that's so that part. I think the second thing about living in different cultures is I realized that a lot of what I thought was the approach to life was the right way. It's kind of like my way is the right way. And I realized it's not going to work because different cultures literally think differently and have different values. And those values are as right in that environment as mine were right in my environment. And so I learned I learned to be able to not impose my righteousness on others. One, because it also had a very, very practical implication, is that I saw firsthand that when we're right and righteous, nobody can listen. If you want to make a change, if you want to engage people in any change or any difference or any new possibility, first thing we have to be able to do is to engage them in being willing to listen, to even be willing to consider that possibility.
So maybe I can follow that with another thought that's connected. Along the path we talked earlier about the times when you experienced feeling and being invisible as a woman. And I think that one of the early experiences might have been in Saudi Arabia. If you can talk to us about what took you there in the first place, and then how you managed during those very interesting times, and how they potentially changed you and contributed to what you did next.
Yes, I learned a lot of patience, and I learned that it's good to have a sense of humor in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Well, it was being overlooked was a common everyday occurrence in Saudi Arabia. There was one particular time when there was a farewell party at my husband's company. We went there because my husband had an opportunity to run what is the largest Saudi engineering company in Saudi. And there was a farewell party, which isn't what we might think about as a farewell party. People drink orange juice.
Yep.
And there were a group of his colleagues standing, chatting together, who I knew. So I went over to join them. And I was completely left out of the conversation. Even when I said something, it was as if I hadn't spoken. And it was really one of the first times where I'm sure it had happened before, but it was one of the first times where I really just had this experience. It's like they don't even recognize that I'm standing here, let alone I'm saying something. But I it's hurtful and it's all of those things, Lynn, of course. But I think over the years, I've developed a way to be able to use those experiences to better connect with women who I have the privilege and opportunity to work with in developing countries that, I have a life of privilege. And it allows me a deeper connection and understanding with women and girls who live that life day in, day out, day in, day out. And so in that regard, I was grateful for it.
So therefore, from what you've said now, it feels to me like you took so much of those, a couple of experiences you've shared with me today, into your work in the Hunger Project. And I know that work has been seminal for you in the way in which you give to the world and give to women and all those places. So perhaps we can now spend some time just exploring how, why, and I guess what you've achieved and what you've taken out of that for yourself, as well as what you've given.
So the Hunger Project was born in the 1970s. Technically, structurally, it's a charity. But really what it is a movement of people committed to the sustainable end of hunger through people's self-reliance in harmony with nature.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially that every man, woman, and child has access to opportunity. So why I'm saying it was born in the 1970s, that it was at a time when the prevailing conversation in the world is that it's not possible to end hunger. The best we can do is alleviate suffering, right? And therein was born the charitable model of giving, which, has for sure done good in the world, but would never be the model to sustainably end the issue, right? So the Hunger Project really was a realization that, first off, if we're going to sustainably end hunger, we have to get clear about who the people are who live in the conditions of hunger and poverty, and that they're not passive beneficiaries. Who these people are talented, intelligent, hardworking people who, for all of their efforts, cannot raise themselves out of the circumstance, because the circumstance, the structure is set up so that they are systematically denied the opportunity to live lives of self-reliance. Okay? So into that condition, Lynn, was born the Hunger Project, where yes, it's possible. And how it's going to be possible is partnering with people living in the conditions of hunger and poverty to create communities that are self-reliant. Yeah. And in the early 90s, I was invited to join the team as a volunteer in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. Ordinarily, the teams in country, like the Bangladeshi team, are all Bangladeshis. The Indian team is all Indians, Malawians, etc. Right, and it's practical and cost effective, right? Because if you're creating a sustainable movement, that's the only thing that makes sense. They also know their country much better than we do.
Yes.
So Dr. Badil Majumdar, who is an economist of world renown, actually, who had gone back to his country to create a mass movement of the grassroots, of people developed to be able to mobilize their communities for self-reliance. And Lynn, I always say God made the phone ring, because my name got thrown in the hat to be one of the people who could help him kick that off, pretty much. Yes. Right? And one of the reasons that I was chosen is that there are great Bangladeshi women trainers. Right? They tended in those days to come from what I call the Welsh hoil, the fire and brimstone in the pulpit kind of thing. And what Dr. Majumdar was looking for was women who could demonstrate a co-equal partnership between men and women at the front of the room when we were leading these conversations with hundreds of people. And then I had a background in, from Japan, I had a background in transformation and corporate effectiveness and mobilization.
So what do you think was the greatest achievement of that project? So just in a few sentences, the greatest achievement for the women of Bangladesh as you stepped away from that when it became more sustainable?
One of the first work we had 100 people. They're all volunteers, all walks of life, doctors, dentists, farmers. And of the 100, there were 2 women. There were 98 men and 2 women, because it was incredibly difficult to be able to have women participate. They needed permission from everybody. And during the conversation we were having, one of the women very courageously stood up to say something. As soon as she stood up and started speaking, the whole room, the other 98 men, acted like it was a break. Literally started chatting about themselves, got up to make a cup of tea, got up to go to the bathroom. It was like literally as if it was a break. And that was one of the key turning points in my realization of our situation in the world, because I had, it was like this microcosm in the world right in front of my eyes, right? Women with something to say and nobody willing to listen and being regarded as of no consequence, right? And Lynn, that was actually the moment when I said, this will end. We will have a co-equal partnership between men and women.
I think I recall that by the end of your time there, you had a co-equal partnership and you did have women with a voice.
Well, over the next few years, we committed ourselves pretty much right away to 50% men, 50% women. It really took something. And then Dr. Majumdar came up with a new element of the strategy, which was to have people from local government officials participate in what we called it the animator training. It was a 5-day tools, skills, etc., transformational program to give people mobilization tools. And then the local government, because they hold all of the money as well as the resources to enable the end of hunger in villages and townships, etc. And that really changed something. And then many more women came forward as local government officials, etc. But I'll tell you, when I back a few years, the local councillor came to visit a village where they really made schools happen, fresh water happen, schools for the girls and the boys. Right? They'd ended child marriage in the village, all those things. And the councillor came to visit to congratulate them, and he stepped to the husband and wife joint that were welcoming him, and he stepped in to shake the gentleman's hand. And he said, congratulations on everything that you have done there. And he said, no, he said, I'm not the leader here. It is my wife. Those moments. So of the animators, so the people we trained to be mobilizers, there are now almost 400,000 trained volunteer mobilizers throughout the country, right, doing the work, and they have measurement tools. They have charted where hunger is in. You know, hunger is said to have ended where the infant mortality rate falls below 50 per thousand live births. So they're real measures for the end of hunger.
And that's it's a significant achievement for women. It's a significant achievement for that country, but more globally. So I know you've been based in Hong Kong for quite some years. I'd love to hear about some of your work there and some of your achievements, because you've won awards and you're a very well-known leader across the space of gender.
Well, Hong Kong is a unique city. And the great thing about Hong Kong is it's the biggest village in town. So it's not difficult to get established. One of the networking groups I joined was the American Chamber of Commerce. American Chamber of Commerce here, because I had run a business. So I actually work with corporations in leadership development, etc. So the American Chamber of Commerce is the oldest chamber here in Hong Kong. It also has the most events. We have 200 events every year. And one of the events we put on that I was particularly interested in is called the Women of Influence Awards. So for 21 years, we've put on, and I've been part of it when I was here first, and now that I'm back for the last 15 years, we award 9 women and 1 company, which is the best place to work for women. And we award 1 man who is known as an advocate for women. You know, he has to demonstrate mentorship, sponsorships, etc. So 9 women for being on boards, young entrepreneur, charitable, etc., etc.
Yep.
And they are the most prestigious awards in Hong Kong for women. And people want to win the awards. And of course, in order to win the awards, they have to satisfy certain criteria. So, you know, the awards drive the criterion and therefore drive the right kinds of activities. So I was part of the steering committee for 15 years, and now I'm a liaison to the awards. So that's been very, very potent, yes. And I think part of it's not completely instrumental but part of the Hong Kong Exchange here a few years ago declared that in order to float on the Hong Kong Exchange, companies that are measured on the Hang Seng Index,
yes.
all had to have at least one woman on their board, right, by the end of last year. So the ones you'd expect, you know, HSBC has 30%, more than 30% women. Manulife is over the so the ones you would expect, you know, have 30% plus. But there are many, many family-owned companies in Hong Kong that didn't have any. So that number has gone down from 176 without a woman to, I think we're now down to 30. So those, you know, it all matters, right? It all contributes and makes a difference.
And that's all about policy and legislation and the finance word and governance all coming together around the need for gender equality and giving women a voice, an equal voice, as you said in the Hunger Project, is having a co-equal partnership between men and women. So what else do you think, you know, some of us have immense concerns about the pathway to gender equality or gender parity. You know, we hear all the stats from the World Economic Forum. We hear it all talk to us. We hear the incredible issues around gender-based violence, etc. What has to happen going forward in maybe in that notion of co-equal partnerships? You know, just explore for a few minutes your views and reflections on where do we go from here as a world and as a local community and as a nation.
I think if we each find a place to participate and make a difference, and you know, there are people who you've interviewed, you know, who are working on global policy. You know, please continue to do that. You know, there are people who are working on national policy. Please continue to do that. There are people who are working on, you know, within the Hunger Project. We'll continue to do that. In Hong Kong as well, I work with we set up a charity which is for ethnic minority young women, university students. You know, they're invisible here, right? Super smart. They help them with a network, a professional network, find paid internships and get them positioned, you know, as lawyers, doctors, dentists, et cetera. We have the Women's Foundation here. It works with women at all stratas in society. No, and I think sometimes we get distracted because we think we should be doing some grandiose something, right? And that's not for everybody. You know, if every one of us took on one young woman or girl and mentored them and helped them to be successful, you know, in all of the ways that we can do that, things would really get better. Yes. So what's my point? My point is we each have something that we can contribute.
And is some of it, I know I'm digressing from what we might have talked about, but is it related to, as women in particular, encouraging men to also work with young women and young men around what is a good way to be a good young man? And also, is it about us all believing we have those qualities of being remarkable to actually do it and not shying away from the fact that we have the power, that we have the personal power and the personal capability, skills and beliefs to do that? You got any thoughts on that?
I think definitely we are at a place in our development as women that there's like the next quantum leap to take, for sure. I don't know that anybody knows particularly what that looks like. But I do think it starts with us. I mean, I know certainly for me, it started with being introspective, and it started with me being willing to see where I was actually part of perpetuating the status quo, rather than standing firm for what I saw was possible. I used to travel a lot, Lynn, and as soon as I would come home, my husband and my son would say to me, "What's for dinner, Mom?" Right? I know it makes no sense whatsoever. It makes even less sense that I tried to answer.
But that just means we're imperfect humans, doesn't it?
Well, we're imperfect humans, but it was very, very helpful for me to start to see for myself where I was entrenched in old ways of thinking, and therefore where I was perpetuating those old ways of operating, and therefore I could have a choice about them and give them up. I would really like to see more of that happening, right? Not being bad to ourselves, not making ourselves wrong, but it's like, because it's revelatory, the degree that we are.
Absolutely. And I guess we might have a view that in our generation, and we do share a generation, that was entrenched in us, and trying to shrug off or kick away some of those old entrenched behaviours. We will be imperfect because we'll regress from time to time as we change our thinking and those around us. And I guess if our younger women and men are still in some of those entrenched behaviours, we have more generations to go. But it's a challenging space, isn't it, for all of us, and it'll continue to be so.
It really is, Lynn. And I in a workshop that I led years ago in Singapore, I'll never forget the words of this. She actually was a brain surgeon, and it was women from all different professions had come together, and we come to explore what it is to be a woman in today's world, and how we can break out of the constraints. Yes. Anyway, she's a brain surgeon, and she stood up to share, and people were like, "God, your work must be so difficult," and blah, blah, blah. And she was vulnerable, and she said, "My challenge isn't my work. My challenge is my husband, because we have 3 children, and I'm expected to do everything at home. He does nothing." He doesn't do the homework, he doesn't do the cooking, he doesn't do the shopping. And she said, and it's worse than that, because it's all held in place by my parents and his parents. There are allies groups, male allies groups, young male allies groups, who are really doing some great work on investigating for themselves, what have we inherited as men and young men, and what of it is what of it that we want to hold on to, and what is it that we want to let go of, right? If we can carve out our own who we're committed to being, what is it that we have to say? And more and more those groups are springing up.
It's been very, very exciting for me, and I hope for you. What are your greatest leadership gifts? Top 2 or 3?
So first off, it's never just one, right? It's never just my leadership gifts. I'm always working with great people. And I'm a storyteller. And I've had the great fortune in the people I've grown up with to be able to engage people. I genuinely care, and I can listen deeply and connect with people. But maybe this is the most important, is I refuse to believe that something can't be done.
And it is that takes us forward, isn't it, Felicity? It is that refusing to believe that it's not possible. So, Felicity, with that as a resounding message from you for everyone who's watching or listening to this podcast, I have to say thank you very much. I've enjoyed getting to know you. I've enjoyed our conversation. I wish you well in whatever you do next. And Zontra International is very proud to have you as our friend.
Lynn, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege, and it's been so good to meet you personally. Yes. Thank you for everything you do, Lynn.